An elderly millionaire was turned away from a high-end car dealership simply because of how he was dressed. But just moments later, he returned, and what he did left everyone in complete disbelief. George Mason was a man who consistently defied what people thought of him. At the age of 78, he had quietly built a substantial fortune over the course of his life, but almost no one knew about it. To the casual observer, George seemed like any other older man. He was always dressed in the same shirts that had grown threadbare with time, plain trousers, and shoes that had long since lost their polish. His appearance was simple, even shabby, but that never concerned George. For George, a person's true value wasn't defined by their material wealth or appearance. It was rooted in their actions and character. Living in a small, modest home in the suburbs, his daily routine was almost monastic in its simplicity. He woke up early every morning and took a walk around his neighborhood, stopping to greet old friends and acquaintances with a calm, friendly smile. His life was quiet and peaceful. Most of his time was spent doing ordinary things, working in his garden, reading the books he loved, and visiting his daughter Emma and his grandson Noah. Emma had been through many hardships, including a difficult divorce, but George always stood by her. In George's mind, money was never the key to happiness, and he lived as though it meant very little to him. He led a life that many might call austere, using his wealth sparingly and carefully. But the secret he kept from nearly everyone was that many years earlier, he had won an enormous sum in the lottery. Instead of changing his lifestyle or drawing attention to his good fortune, George had made the choice to live simply, putting most of his winnings into investments and saving it for a day when it would really count. That day came during one of his visits to the hospital, where Noah, now 7 years old, was undergoing treatment. Noah had always had a special light in his eyes whenever he talked about cars, a passion that seemed to burn brighter the more he talked about them. During one of their conversations, Noah confided in his grandfather that his biggest dream was to ride in a Ferrari. To Noah, exotic cars like Ferraris weren't just about speed and luxury. They represented excitement, adventure, and most of all, a sense of freedom. Seeing Noah's life still so full of hopes and dreams, despite his young age and current struggles, George knew he had to make his grandson's dream a reality. It was a simple wish, yet it meant the world to Noah, and George wasn't about to let it slip away. He made a decision. He was going to buy a Ferrari for his grandson, no matter what it took. On a Saturday morning, with determination in his heart, George dressed in his best shirt. Though it was his finest, it too had seen better days, showing signs of wear and age. But George didn't mind. He left his house with a clear purpose: to fulfill his grandson's dream, a dream that had become his own. He knew from the start that this wasn't going to be simple. The thought of stepping into a luxury car dealership, an environment entirely out of his usual comfort zone, gave him a feeling of unease. But none of that mattered compared to the joy he wanted to bring to his grandson, Noah. As George made his way to the dealership, he couldn't help but think about how money had never been his main focus in life. Still, he was about to spend it in the best way he knew, to bring a smile to Noah's face, and that alone made it worthwhile. When he arrived, the dealership stood tall and imposing, its glass and steel facade gleaming in the sunlight. George paused briefly, took a deep breath, and walked through the glass doors. His steps were measured and confident, but the grandeur of the place was undeniable. The gleaming luxury cars were showcased under bright, flawless lighting, each vehicle a symbol of wealth and success. George's simple attire made him stand out even more among the polished surroundings. He approached one of the cars, his eyes fixed on the sleek lines of a Ferrari that shone brightly in front of him. It was as if the car was calling out to him, a work of art waiting to fulfill a dream he had for his grandson. As George admired the car in silence, lost in thought, A voice broke the moment sharply. "Can I assist you, sir?" David, the dealership's manager, asked with a smile that felt forced, his eyes quickly scanning George up and down with clear judgment. David, dressed in an immaculate suit, was no stranger to quickly assessing the potential of his clients, and based on George's appearance, he didn't see him as someone likely to afford the high-end cars on display. George, remaining calm and unbothered by the tone, replied, "Yes, I'm here to buy a Ferrari." David almost laughed at the notion. To him, the statement seemed absurd. "A Ferrari?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Are you sure, sir? These cars, they come with a price tag that's probably beyond what you're used to." George's response was direct and unshaken. "I know what I'm here for. My grandson wants to ride in a Ferrari, and I'm here to buy one for him." For a moment, there was silence. To George, it felt like a long, drawn-out pause. David stood there, looking around, almost as if he were expecting someone to jump out and confirm that this was some kind of joke. But as he realized George wasn't kidding, his expression shifted from skepticism to thinly veiled disdain. "Look, sir," David began, his voice taking on a sarcastic edge, "I think you might want to reconsider joking about something like this. Ferraris aren't for just anyone. Maybe you should try looking at something a little more suitable." George could feel the sting of humiliation rising, but maintained his composure. "I'm not joking," he said firmly. "I have the means to buy this car, and I'm ready to make the purchase right now." But David wasn't interested in listening. His patience wearing thin, he stepped closer, his gesture brisk and dismissive, pointing toward the exit. "I think we're done here," he said coldly, clearly wanting George to leave. "It's probably best if you leave before I have to get security involved. I don't want any trouble here." Those words hit George hard, like a slap to the face. For a man of his age, who rarely let small things bother him, this was different. He suddenly felt a mix of shame and sadness wash over him. Being treated this way wasn't something he was used to, especially not when all he wanted was to make his grandson's wish come true. George, visibly shaken, turned and slowly started to walk toward the exit. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the worn leather wallet in his pocket, a habit when he was nervous. This whole encounter felt like more than just a disruption to his plans. It was a blow to his pride. As he reached the glass doors of the showroom, ready to leave, a voice broke through the tense silence. "Sir, wait!" George stopped in his tracks and turned around, his eyes landing on a young man hurrying toward him. It was Michael, one of the salespeople at the dealership. Unlike David, who had been so cold and dismissive, Michael had a warm and approachable look on his face that immediately eased some of the tension building inside George. "I'm really sorry about my colleague's behavior," Michael said, his tone full of genuine regret. "He shouldn't have spoken to you like that. Please, come back inside. I'd be more than happy to help you." George hesitated for a moment, still hearing the sting of David's harsh words echo in his mind. His body remained still, but something about Michael's sincerity made him reconsider. There was a kindness in this young man's voice that George hadn't expected to find here. "I'm not sure," George murmured, his voice carrying the weight of his doubt. "I completely understand," Michael replied quickly, nodding in understanding. "But if you really want to make your grandson's dream a reality, let me help you. We don't have to rush. We can take our time, look at the cars together, and I promise you, the experience will be nothing like what you've just been through." As Michael continued to speak, David, who had been standing off to the side, watching the situation unfold with clear impatience, suddenly received a phone call. The call seemed urgent, and without saying a word, David stormed out of the dealership, leaving George and Michael alone in the vast showroom. George turned back to Michael, still unsure, but he saw something in the young man's eyes, a genuine desire to help, to make things right. With a deep sigh, George finally nodded. Maybe there was still a chance to fulfill Noah's wish after all. Michael's face broke into a broad smile, and he extended his hand toward George. "Let's go, sir. I'm sure we'll find the perfect Ferrari for your grandson." Reluctantly at first, but with growing hope, George followed Michael through the luxurious showroom. The Ferraris, with their vibrant colors and sleek, immaculate designs, looked like pieces of art. As they walked, Michael began passionately explaining the features of each model, talking about the incredible horsepower, the speed, and the advanced technology that made these cars stand out from the rest. George listened politely, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The sleek cars in the showroom gleamed under the lights, their shine reflecting the luxury and power they represented, but George's thoughts were far from the glossy exteriors. Worry, a constant, pressing concern for his grandson Noah, was all-consuming in his mind. The boy's dream of riding in a Ferrari had become more than just a childhood wish. It was something George felt deeply responsible for, a mission he needed to complete. Standing there, lost in thought, George's gaze drifted over the cars, not truly seeing them. His thoughts were elsewhere, far beyond the dealership walls. Noticing George's distant expression, Michael, the salesman, hesitated before speaking. He had a feeling there was more going on beneath the surface. "Mr. George," Michael said carefully, his voice kind but curious. "I could be wrong, but it seems like there's something more behind your interest in this car. It doesn't feel like it's just about owning a luxury vehicle." George, normally a man of few words and even fewer personal conversations, felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the sincerity in Michael's voice, or perhaps it was the way Michael didn't push, but instead offered an opening for him to speak. Whatever it was, George found himself willing to share what had been weighing on his heart. He sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that comes from carrying a heavy burden. "You're right, Michael," he began, his voice quiet, but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about buying a car." Michael remained silent, his attention fully on George, encouraging him to continue without needing to say a word. George's eyes clouded with emotion as he spoke again. "It's about my grandson, Noah. He's only 7 years old, but he's already faced more challenges than any child should ever have to. He's always been full of life, so much energy, and a huge love for cars. Ferraris to him are something magical, his ultimate dream." George's voice wavered, and he had to pause, taking a moment to regain his composure. Michael could feel the depth of George's emotions, sensing that the story he was sharing was filled with a kind of pain that words alone couldn't fully express. After a moment, George continued, "Not too long ago, we found out that Noah is sick. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis." George's voice dropped, his tone somber. "It's a degenerative disease, and it's slowly taking away everything he loves. The doctors, they've told us that we don't have much time left." George's voice cracked with the weight of those words. "All I want is to make his dream come true before it's too late. To give him the chance to ride in a Ferrari, just once. To give him that one moment of joy. That's why I'm here." Michael felt his heart tighten as he listened. He had heard of multiple sclerosis before, but the idea of a child suffering from it, a boy who was so young, was hard to fathom. He glanced at George, no longer seeing him as just another customer. Instead, he saw a grandfather desperately trying to create a moment of happiness for his grandson in the face of an unbearable reality. "Mr. George," Michael started, his own voice catching with emotion. He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself before continuing. "I had no idea. I'm really sorry for what you and your family are going through." George nodded, feeling thankful for the compassion. "I just want to do something for him, Michael. He deserves some happiness, and I have the power to give that to him." Michael, now with a sense of purpose, recognized this wasn't just another sale. It was a chance to be a part of something meaningful, something that truly mattered. He knew he had to take action. "Mr. George, I will do everything I can to help you and Noah," Michael said with determination. "I'll talk to my mum, Elizabeth, who owns the dealership. She needs to hear this story. I'm sure she'll want to help." The offer caught George off guard, and he was extremely grateful. "You'd do that for us?" he asked. "Yes," Michael said with confidence. "This isn't just a transaction. This is about making a real difference in Noah's life, and we're going to make that happen." George's story and Noah's wish deeply moved Michael. It was clear this wasn't an ordinary customer looking for a luxury car. It was a grandfather trying to fulfill one final dream for a grandson battling a terrible illness. Michael understood he needed to act fast and do it right. He stepped away from George and picked up the phone, dialing his mother, Elizabeth. For something like this, she had to be involved. This wasn't about business. It was personal. His hands shook slightly as he pressed the numbers. The phone rang, and the urgency inside him grew. After a few rings, Elizabeth picked up. "Michael, did something happen?" she asked, her voice full of concern, as it wasn't usual for her son to call during work hours unless it was serious. "Mum, I need you to come to the dealership. It's important," Michael said, trying to keep calm but unable to hide the urgency in his tone. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth asked, now sounding more worried. "It's not the store, Mom. It's something else. There's a man here, George Mason. He's trying to buy a Ferrari, but his story is something you need to hear in person. Please, come as soon as you can. It's about his grandson, Noah. He's sick, and this purchase means more than just a car." Elizabeth was silent for a moment, letting Michael's words sink in. She had always trusted her son's judgment, and if he was telling her this situation was serious, she knew there was no time to waste. "I'm on my way," Elizabeth said firmly into the phone. "Make sure Mr. George stays put. Don't let him leave. I'll be there as quickly as possible." When the call ended, Michael felt a sense of relief wash over him. He was confident his mother would know exactly how to handle this delicate situation with the sensitivity and experience it required. With that settled, Michael knew his next priority was keeping George calm and comfortable while they waited. He returned to where the elderly man was sitting, his face still clouded with worry. George had placed his hands neatly in his lap, staring down at them, clearly lost in thought about Noah. He wanted so much to make the boy's dream a reality, but David's recent behavior, coupled with the complicated circumstances, had left George feeling unsure and unsteady. "Mr. George, my mother is on her way," Michael said, offering a reassuring smile. "She's eager to meet you and hear your story." George looked up, startled by how quickly Michael had taken action. "She's really coming?" "I don't want to cause any trouble or inconvenience her," George said, his voice soft but still lined with doubt. "Not at all," Michael responded quickly, sitting down beside him. "She cares a lot about what we're doing here, and I'm sure she'll want to help in any way she can." George nodded slowly, taking some comfort in Michael's words, though the weight of his concerns still hung over him. Noticing the tension in George's posture, Michael decided to steer the conversation in a lighter direction to ease the old man's mind. "Mr. George, did you know that this Ferrari, right here, is one of the fastest cars in our showroom?" Michael pointed to a sleek red model parked nearby. "It can go from 0 to 60 in less than 3 seconds, he added with a grin. "I bet Noah would be over the moon about that." A small smile tugged at the corners of George's mouth. He would be thrilled, without a doubt. Noah's always had a passion for cars. Ever since he was a little boy, he collected miniature models and knew the names of every single one by heart, George said, his voice softening as he talked about his grandson. Michael kept the conversation flowing, asking more questions about Noah, wanting to learn everything he could about the boy. Even though he hadn't met Noah, he already felt a connection to him, sensing how much this meant to George. Every time the older man spoke about his grandson, there was a noticeable glimmer of both pride and sadness in his eyes. It was clear how much he adored Noah and how deeply he wanted to give him something special. As they continued to talk, the minutes seemed to pass more quickly. Michael made sure to keep George engaged, pointing out more Ferraris, discussing the history of the brand, and even sharing a few amusing stories from some of his past customers. George gradually began to feel more at ease, sensing that there was someone who genuinely cared about him and Noah. The weight on his shoulders lightened just a bit as he sat there with Michael, engaged in conversation. About 30 minutes passed before the dealership doors opened once more. This time, Elizabeth walked in, her presence immediately commanding the room. She carried herself with poise, her posture straight, exuding an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Her eyes scanned the room, quickly locking onto Michael and George, who were sitting across from each other. Michael, noticing his mother's arrival, stood up promptly and moved toward her. "Mum, this is Mr. George Mason," he said, gesturing toward the elderly man as he approached. Elizabeth walked over, her expression softening as she extended her hand to George with a welcoming smile. "Mr. George, it's a pleasure to meet you. Michael mentioned your visit, and I wanted to be here to help in any way that I can." George, though visibly tired, slowly stood up, taking Elizabeth's hand in his own. The gratitude in his eyes was unmistakable. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I wasn't sure where else to turn, but your son was so kind to me." "Michael has always had a big heart," Elizabeth responded, glancing fondly at her son before turning her attention back to George. "Now, please, tell me more about Noah and how we might be able to help him." George took a deep breath, steadying himself before beginning to recount Noah's story. He spoke about his grandson's incredible passion for cars and how his eyes would light up whenever he talked about them, especially Ferraris. Noah had an almost magical fascination with the sleek, powerful machines, seeing them as the pinnacle of automotive excellence. As George shared this, the emotion in his voice became more palpable. Elizabeth listened closely, her attention never wavering. Each word George spoke revealed the deep love he had for his grandson and the painful reality they were now facing due to Noah's illness. Michael remained nearby, quietly observing the shift in his mother's expression as the story unfolded. Her initial air of authority softened into something more personal and empathetic. George continued, his voice trembling slightly as he shared Noah's one true wish. "All he wants," George said, his voice catching with emotion, "is to have the chance to ride in a Ferrari, just once. That's all he's ever talked about. And I'd give anything to make that dream come true for him." Elizabeth felt a lump in her throat as she listened to George's words. A tear slipped down her cheek, which she quickly brushed away with her fingertips. The simplicity of the wish, just a ride in a car, yet filled with so much meaning, struck her deeply. It wasn't about the car itself, but about granting a moment of happiness to a child who was facing an unimaginable battle. This wasn't about making a sale, it was about something far more significant. "Mr. George," Elizabeth began, her voice gentle but steady, "your story has touched my heart. I can't imagine the pain your family is going through, but I understand just how much this moment would mean to Noah. That's why I've made a decision." George looked at her with a mix of anxiety and curiosity, sensing that something important was about to be said. Michael, sitting nearby, also leaned in, waiting for his mother's words with bated breath. Elizabeth, her expression warm but serious, finally spoke. "I want to give you the Ferrari at no cost," she said, her smile sincere and full of kindness. "Consider it a gift to Noah. He deserves to have this experience, and we want to be part of that special moment." George blinked, utterly caught off guard. He hadn't expected this. He never imagined such an overwhelming gesture of generosity. For a moment, he felt a wave of confusion wash over him, not sure how to respond to something so far beyond what he had anticipated. Michael, sitting beside him, broke into a wide grin, clearly thrilled and proud of his mother's decision to be so giving. "Miss Elizabeth, George struggled to find the right words, his voice shaky as he tried to process what was happening. "I don't know what to say." His words were filled with genuine surprise as the magnitude of Elizabeth's offer sank in. "You don't need to say anything, Mr. George," Elizabeth replied gently, her tone soft but firm. "This is our way of helping Noah fulfill his dream. There's no way I could charge you for something that means this much to both of you." George stood there, silent for a few moments, his emotions visibly welling up in his eyes. His gratitude was immense, and the generosity before him almost felt overwhelming. But as the weight of the moment passed, a more determined expression began to take over his features. He knew in his heart that what Elizabeth was offering was incredibly kind, but he also felt a deep conviction. He had the means to pay for the car, and he believed strongly in fairness, even in moments like this. "Miss Elizabeth," he said again, his voice now steady and resolute, "I deeply appreciate your kindness. What you've offered means the world to me and Noah." He paused briefly, gathering his thoughts. "But I have to be honest with you. I'm not a poor man. In fact, I'm a millionaire." He gave a small, humble smile. "Years ago, I won a fortune in the lottery, but I've always chosen to live modestly because I've never believed that money defines who we are." Elizabeth and Michael exchanged surprised looks, both of them clearly taken aback by this unexpected revelation. The man who stood before them, dressed so simply and who had never given any hint of wealth, was actually a millionaire. But what struck them more than the fact of his wealth was how little it seemed to matter to him, how he had never allowed it to change who he was as a person. "I understand what you're trying to do, and I am incredibly grateful," George continued, his voice steady with resolve. "But I really feel strongly about paying for the Ferrari. I have the resources, and it's important to me that this transaction be fair. If you're willing to accept, I'd like to pay the fair price for the car. Your gesture will still mean just as much. But this is something I need to do." For a brief moment, Elizabeth found herself lost for words. George's sincerity and strong moral compass were truly something to admire. This wasn't just about purchasing a car for him, it was about preserving his principles and staying true to himself, even in such an emotional moment. "If that's what you want, Mr. George, we'll respect your decision," Elizabeth finally said, offering a warm, understanding smile. "But I want you to know that your gesture means just as much to us. This won't be just another vehicle we sell. It will serve as a reminder of what's really important in life." Michael, still taking it all in, walked over to George and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. George, you are a remarkable man. Noah's incredibly fortunate to have you as his grandfather." George nodded, feeling a surge of emotions roll through him. He knew that coming to this dealership, and more importantly, sticking to his values, was the right call. The sale of the Ferrari wasn't just another transaction. It was now a symbol of his deep convictions and the immense love he had for his grandson. As they wrapped up the process, Elizabeth and Michael worked diligently to ensure everything was just right. They understood that this moment would be memorable, not only for George and Noah, but for themselves as well. It was a reminder that sometimes business can transcend the material world and tap into the true essence of humanity. With the Ferrari sale nearing completion, Elizabeth and Michael turned their attention to the remaining paperwork. George sat quietly, watching them, still moved by the kindness and respect he'd been shown. He knew he was about to make a dream come true for his grandson, which filled him with a profound sense of calm and fulfillment. "I'll grab the final documents to wrap this up," Elizabeth said, standing up to head back to her office for the paperwork. "I'll be right back." While Elizabeth was away, the door to the dealership swung open again. David, the manager, hurried in, his face tight with frustration. He had been out attending to a personal matter and was still visibly upset. As he stormed across the showroom, David caught a glimpse of George sitting beside Michael, not noticing that Elizabeth was absent. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the older man still there, and irritation flared within him. What was that scruffy old man still doing in the store? Without a second thought, David marched over to George, completely disregarding Michael, and let out a mocking laugh. "Still hanging around, old man?" David sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I thought I'd made it perfectly clear that someone like you doesn't belong here. What do you think you're doing? Trying to buy a Ferrari? Don't be absurd." The sudden hostility from David surprised George, who had been sitting there calmly. His sharp words seemed to come out of nowhere, catching George completely off guard. George opened his mouth to say something, but before any words could come out, Michael moved, as if trying to step in and calm the situation. However, before Michael could do anything, Elizabeth walked back into the room, holding a stack of documents. She arrived just in time to hear the last few words David spat out. Her steps slowed, and she paused, her face reflecting a growing mix of disbelief and fury as she processed what was unfolding before her eyes. Without realizing Elizabeth had returned, David continued his verbal assault on George, his voice rising in both volume and arrogance. "You really think you belong here? This place is for people who can afford it, not for people like you." David's tone dripped with contempt, his words becoming crueler by the second, as if he were taking pleasure in belittling George. Then, suddenly, Elizabeth's voice cut through the room like a sharp knife. "David!" The word was loud and forceful, leaving no room for doubt that she was furious. David froze instantly, recognizing the voice of his boss. Slowly, he turned around, his face draining of color as he saw the cold, furious look in Elizabeth's eyes. "Ms. Elizabeth, I didn't mean," he stammered, trying to find an excuse, but the icy expression on her face made it clear that there was no way out of this situation. "I heard everything," Elizabeth said, cutting him off before he could get another word out. Her voice was calm, but it carried a heavy weight. "And I am disgusted by your behavior. How dare you speak to a customer like that? After everything he's shared with us, how could you even think to mock him?" David's face turned even paler, and his hands began to tremble as he realized how much trouble he was in. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable," Elizabeth continued, her anger controlled but unmistakable. "We pride ourselves on treating every customer with respect and dignity, no matter how they look or how they dress. And you, David, have shown me that you are completely incapable of doing that." Michael stood by silently, watching the scene unfold, knowing full well that his mother was about to deliver the final blow. He felt a mix of satisfaction at seeing David being held accountable and unease at the intensity of the confrontation. Elizabeth stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and David, her gaze still locked onto him. "I've received multiple complaints about you from customers, and I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt. I've given you more than enough chances to improve. But this," she gestured toward George, "this is the last straw. You're fired, David. Now get out of my store." David stood there, completely stunned. The words hit him like a physical blow, and he struggled to process what had just happened. His face flushed with humiliation, and he felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. There was nothing left to say. He knew he couldn't argue his way out of this one. With his face burning from the shame, David turned on his heel and walked out of the dealership, not daring to look back. Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves before turning to George. Her stern demeanor softened as she faced him. "Mr. George, I truly apologize for David's behavior earlier. What he did was completely uncalled for, and I want you to know that it does not reflect the values my family or I stand by." George, who had remained quiet during the entire exchange, finally broke his silence. "Thank you, Miss Elizabeth. I understand, and I respect that you did what you felt was right. However, if you don't mind, I'd like to make a request." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Of course, Mr. George. What would you like to ask?" George's voice softened as he said, "I believe in second chances. Today, your son Michael gave me one by calling me back into the store and allowing me to share my story. I'd like to ask that you give David that same opportunity. He might not understand kindness fully just yet, but I believe he has the potential to change." Michael, standing nearby, looked at George with newfound respect, while Elizabeth considered the request, her mind turning over George's words. She knew he was being more generous than most would be in his situation, especially after the way David had treated him. It made her appreciate George even more. After a long pause, she responded, "If that's what you're asking for, I'll think about it. But David will need to prove that he is willing to change." George nodded, his face showing satisfaction with her answer. "Sometimes, all it takes is a little guidance to set someone on the right path," he said thoughtfully. With the tension between them finally easing, Elizabeth and Michael returned to the table to finalize the paperwork. The deal was complete, the documents were signed, and the Ferrari was officially ready to be handed over to George. They all knew that Noah's dream of driving the car could now become a reality. With the tension easing, Elizabeth and Michael returned to the table to finish the deal. With the paperwork completed and everything settled, they prepared to hand over the Ferrari to George, ensuring Noah's dream was within reach. Soon after, the dealership was buzzing with energy and focus. Elizabeth, Michael, and George knew there wasn't a moment to lose. With the contract signed and the Ferrari ready, they moved swiftly. The late afternoon sun was casting a warm, golden glow across the city as George, holding the keys to the Ferrari, felt the weight of what was ahead. He glanced at Elizabeth and Michael, who walked with him to the exit, ready to follow him to the hospital where Noah was waiting. Everyone knew the moment had arrived, and there was no more time to spare. The shiny, commanding Ferrari stood in front of the dealership like it had been waiting for this exact moment. The engine was already purring, a low, powerful hum that signaled it was ready to take George to see his grandson. "Let's go now," George said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Noah deserves this, and we can't wait any longer." Michael nodded, fully understanding the urgency in George's voice. "We'll be right behind you, Mr. George," Michael replied. He and Elizabeth got into a second car, prepared to follow the Ferrari to the hospital. As George drove through the city, the Ferrari glided through the streets with a quiet grace, though its presence certainly turned heads. The drive to the hospital was short, but for George it felt like a significant journey. His heart raced with the thought of Noah's reaction to the car. When they arrived, the late afternoon sun cast warm colors across the sky, setting a perfect scene for the moment that was about to unfold. George parked the Ferrari right in front of the hospital's main entrance, his heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, The usual seriousness of the hospital lingered, but that day, something was about to shift. With Elizabeth and Michael at his side, George walked with purpose through the hallways, every step building toward an unforgettable moment. Emma was sitting by her son's bed when they entered the room, holding his small hand tenderly. She looked up as her father walked in, with Elizabeth and Michael trailing behind. Emma's face instantly lit up with a mix of surprise and emotion as she sensed something special was happening. "Dad, what's going on?" Emma asked, standing to embrace him. George hugged her warmly, feeling the weight of her worries. "Emma, I made Noah's wish come true," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I brought him a Ferrari. He's going to get that ride he's always dreamed of." Emma put her hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the tears welling up in her eyes. She knew how much that wish meant to Noah and what it symbolized for her father. "Did you really do this, Dad? You actually brought a Ferrari?" George, full of emotion, nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, it's waiting for him outside." Noah, though lying weak in bed, had overheard the conversation. His eyes widened with surprise and pure joy. "Grandpa, is that really a Ferrari?" Noah asked, his voice soft but brimming with hope. George moved closer to the bed, gently clasping Noah's small, fragile hand. "Yes, my boy. It's a real Ferrari, just for you," George reassured him, his voice warm and steady. "How about we take it for a spin?" With the help of a nurse, Noah was carefully prepared to leave the room. His thin frame was handled gently, and once he was ready, Emma and George eased him into a wheelchair. Outside, Elizabeth and Michael stood waiting, both eager to witness the joy that was sure to come. As the group moved out of the hospital doors, Noah's eyes widened in disbelief. There, right in front of the entrance, gleamed a stunning red Ferrari. All traces of tiredness seemed to vanish from Noah's face. His once weary eyes lit up with excitement, and a wide, delighted smile stretched across his face. "Grandpa, it's the most beautiful Ferrari I've ever seen," Noah exclaimed, his voice suddenly full of life and awe. George, choking back tears, returned the smile, his own heart swelling with emotion. "And today, it's all yours," he said. "Let's go for that ride." Michael and Elizabeth stepped forward to help George as they gently lifted Noah out of the wheelchair and into the sleek passenger seat of the Ferrari. Even though his body was frail, Noah was utterly engrossed in the event. His small hands reached for the steering wheel, tracing the curves of the dashboard. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if committing every detail of the moment to memory, wanting to savor it forever. George got behind the wheel, buckled his seatbelt, and turned to his grandson. "Ready, champ?" he asked. Noah, still beaming with excitement, nodded eagerly. As George turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life, filling the air with the unmistakable sound of power. Noah's face lit up even brighter, his eyes sparkling with pure joy. Slowly, George began to drive, taking the car through the streets while Noah reveled in every second. The hum of the engine, the speed, the blur of the outside world. It was a sensory overload that Noah welcomed with open arms. For him, the moments felt endless, as if time itself had slowed down just for this ride. Every corner they turned, every gentle push on the accelerator, filled Noah with wonder. It was a dream made real, a brief escape into a world of happiness far removed from the hospital walls. When the ride came to an end and they returned to the hospital, George parked the Ferrari right in front of the entrance. Noah, still glowing with excitement, turned to his grandfather, his eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "This was the best day of my life." George, his own eyes misty, held Noah's hand tightly. Tears rolled silently down his cheeks as he smiled. "I'd do anything for you, Noah. Seeing you happy, that's all that matters." As they brought Noah back inside, the magic of that moment lingered in the air. Emma hugged her father tightly, her heart full of silent thanks for everything he had done for her son. Elizabeth and Michael had been paying close attention, and the experience touched them deeply. They realized they had witnessed something far more profound than any simple business deal. That afternoon, a heartfelt wish had come true, creating a moment no one would ever forget. In the weeks following Noah's ride in the Ferrari, the Mason family found themselves caught between feelings of happiness and sorrow. The joy that lit up Noah's face during that brief moment of bliss stayed fresh in everyone's memory. But the harsh truth of his illness remained. As the doctors had foreseen, Noah passed away shortly after. The loss weighed heavily on George, Emma, and everyone who had known and loved Noah. Despite the sadness, there was a comforting peace in knowing that Noah's wish had been granted. To George, that ride wasn't just a goodbye. It was a priceless gift he would cherish forever. For Elizabeth and Michael, the experience left a profound impact on their hearts as well. Noah's story and George's devotion left an everlasting impression on their lives. They knew they couldn't allow this memory to simply fade away. They needed to ensure that Noah's spirit continued to inspire not just the Mason family, but anyone who came through their dealership. It was then that Elizabeth had an idea she couldn't wait to share with Michael. "We can't just keep Noah in our memories," she said one day as they walked through the dealership. "We have to make sure his story inspires others. Let's rename the dealership in his honor." Michael, clearly moved by the idea, agreed without hesitation. "That would be incredible. Noah's story can live on here and remind us all of what truly matters." With the decision made, Elizabeth and Michael set out to rebrand the dealership. They wanted the new name and identity to reflect the values Noah had stirred in them: compassion, kindness, and the pursuit of dreams. Meanwhile, David, who had been fired after his argument with Elizabeth, went through a significant personal change. The scare of nearly losing everything, coupled with George's plea for him to have a second chance, led David to reflect deeply on his actions. He began attending self-improvement courses, striving to be more considerate and empathetic. Sometime later, David reached out to Elizabeth, not to ask for his old job back, but simply to say thank you. "Ms. Elizabeth," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I know I made a lot of mistakes and deserve to be fired. But Mr. George's kindness really touched me on a deep level. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for giving me another opportunity to better myself." As Elizabeth looked into David's eyes, she saw genuine remorse and could tell that he had truly changed. "David," she said softly, "I'm glad you took this chance. It's not easy to find people who can admit when they've done wrong and then work to turn their lives around. Keep pushing forward, and who knows, maybe one day we'll have the chance to work together again." As the days went by, the renovations at the dealership were finally completed. The long-awaited grand reopening day arrived, and Elizabeth extended invitations to George, Emma, as well as several friends and loyal customers to join the ceremony. The event wasn't just another commercial gathering. It was a moment to honor the life and legacy of Noah, a celebration of his impact on everyone who knew him. George and Emma arrived early, walking hand in hand, both visibly moved by what they saw. The dealership had a fresh, new facade, proudly displaying the name Noah Mason Dealership in bold letters. Just below the name, in smaller, more elegant script, were the words, "Where dreams come true." During the ceremony, Elizabeth stepped up to give a speech. Her voice trembled slightly, but she spoke from the heart. "Today, we aren't simply unveiling a new name for this dealership," she said. "We're honoring the memory of a young boy who showed us all what true generosity and love look like. Noah's legacy will continue to live on in this place, inspiring us to be better and to help others make their dreams a reality. The crowd stood silent, hanging on every word. Moved by the moment, George walked to the stage to share his own thoughts. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. Noah was always full of life, George began, and his greatest dream was to ride in a Ferrari. Watching him live that dream was the happiest moment of my life. But what happened afterward and the incredible support from everyone here showed me that Noah's spirit continues to live on. This dealership now bears his name, and with that, his memory will inspire everyone who walks through these doors. At last, the moment arrived. The plaque, which had been carefully covered throughout the ceremony, was finally unveiled. The crowd erupted into applause as they saw the words, "Where dreams come true," gleaming in the sunlight, perfectly encapsulating what the dealership had now become. In the crowd, David smiled as he looked up at the new plaque. He knew deep down that this experience had changed his life forever. After the ceremony, he approached George, once again expressing his heartfelt gratitude for the second chance he had been given. He made a promise to George to continue working on himself and striving to be better. From that day forward, the Noah Mason dealership became more than just a business. It became a symbol of hope, a place where dreams were realized and where people were given the opportunity to start fresh. Everyone who walked through its doors felt the presence of Noah, a boy who loved exotic cars and who, through his legacy, continued to inspire acts of kindness and compassion. His story reminded everyone that no matter how difficult life may be, there's always a chance for dreams to come true. And so, Noah Mason's memory lived on, not just in the hearts of his family, but in the hearts of everyone who heard his story. Thank you for watching today's story. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Drop a like and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the story. See you in the next video.